All right, so in today's video, I want to talk about a really important subject, which is how to stay motivated to practice consistently day in, day out. For some of you, maybe it's easy, but for many of us, it's actually really tricky to maintain a consistent practice schedule. So today, I'm going to share some of the tips that have been really helpful to me throughout the years and have helped me maintain a very consistent practice schedule, sometimes even as much as 4 or 5 hours a day. Although I haven't done that in a while, to be honest. But these tips are what got me there, and hopefully they'll help you as well. So let's dive in right after you hit that subscribe button if you're new on my channel, and hit that like button. Really helps me out. By the way, also, if you're trying to take your playing to the next level and you want some resources, but you're not ready to spend a bunch of money on them, which is probably true of most of us, click the link in the description. You can join the completely free resource course portal that I've put together. It's really awesome. There are different tracks depending on your skill level. I think you're really going to enjoy it. Again, link is in the description. All right, let's talk about some motivational tips here. Now, this first tip is highly essential. It completely transformed my practice sessions basically forever once I started to implement it. So let's talk about something called deep learning. And by the way, I just want to remind you that actually the most important of all these tips, the one that really potentially changed things the most for me, I'm gonna say for last, just to try and keep you to watch this video till the end, but it is really amazing and completely changed my practice routines. So be sure to stick around and check these tips out. If you're not implementing all of them, there's a good chance that you're going to continue to have stale practice routines or lose that motivation. So, all right, let's take a look at this. So deep learning, what is that? Well, for me, based on what I've learned about it, essentially it's the concept of making your brain work full force, which in turn actually leads to the most literal physiological growth of your brain to perform a certain skill better. So it's not deep learning if you're just improvising lines that you're already used to doing, right? But it is deep learning if you're actually focusing in on a very specific skill that makes your brain feel like it is mush, right? Because it's so difficult. In improving that skill, you are really committing something more deep into your memory and into your neurological pathways and your ability. Now, don't quote me on this. I'm not a scientist. If you do want to learn more about that term, deep learning, I'll put a couple of resources that I use to learn in the description. But the most important takeaway here for me is, can you actually make sure that things are sinking into your brain? And are you really concentrating and making sure that they're being committed to your long-term memory or toolbox? So one of the things that I've learned in my own research just about general learning practices is that after about 25 minutes of practice or study, whatever it is, you actually start to experience diminishing returns. Your brain starts to hit that point where, you're getting a bit tired and you're not really making nearly as much focused progress as you were just a few minutes ago. Now, what I started by doing, which actually turned out to be a mistake, was I would set my timer for 25 minutes, and over, every time I hit 25 minutes, whatever I was doing, I would stop and take a break. And I know that a lot of the time folks do that, and it can be helpful, but for me, this tip, and this is why I think it's really interesting, that didn't actually work that well. For me, what works great is to actually set a stopwatch so that you can just see how much time is passing, but don't look at it. Then I want you to practice until you start to feel yourself losing focus. I actually think that you're going to know, and you're going to be the best judge of when that focus starts to really drop off and you're not making the progress you could before. When that happens, take a look at the stopwatch and see how long it's been. If it's been 25 or more minutes, stop and take a break. And taking a break means really taking your mind off of music, off of the piano, doing something else, maybe getting a snack, I don't know, maybe even something longer, go to the gym. But it can be, just 5 minutes of really giving your mind a rest. That can make all the difference so that you can then go back fresh. Now, tip number 2 is pretty cliche, pretty simple, but it's so easy to not implement this tip. Don't try to do too many things at once, and don't make your goals so big that they feel unachievable. If you want to have a larger goal, make sure that it's very clear to yourself that that is a long-term goal, and break that down into simple goals. In fact, what I like to do and what I find the most helpful is to make a list each night of my goals for the next day for practice. And it's really important not to make that overwhelming. So instead of making it like your ideal goal of like, I'm gonna do 4 hours and it's gonna be perfectly broken down like this. Instead, what I want you to do is write down your ideal minimum practice session. So that way, if you achieve this minimum, you did great. And worst comes to worst, you still hit that minimum goal. Awesome. So instead, maybe write out an hour practice session of things that are the most essential for you to improve. So at the end of the day, even if you only got that hour in, you know that you made some really important progress. Then you can make the other stuff on a more additional list. So if you actually get the other stuff done, that's like a huge bonus, right? That's awesome. And I find that that mental adjustment can really, really help with motivation. Now, again, a reminder to make sure that those goals are bite-sized, something that you really can achieve in a day, right? It could just be, 20 minutes of working on this thing. But this brings me to the next tip. Try to make your goals as tangible as possible. So instead of just 20 minutes working on XYZ, which I used to do all the time, I would just say 20 minutes of sight reading, 20 minutes of voicing practice. It's not specific enough, and so you're not gonna feel that you've accomplished something if you just do 20 minutes of voicing practice. Instead, make something much more tangible. Become comfortable sight reading page 3 of this piece, right? Be able to sight read down page 3 without a mistake. Or be able to move my major 9 voicing chromatically without mistakes, right? Don't make it about practicing all the intervals and say intervallic voicing practice. Instead, just say, I want to be able to do half steps. That's my goal for today. If you accomplish it, awesome. If you can do some other intervals, great. That's just icing on the cake. Now, in just a couple minutes, I am going to tell you about that final and potentially most important tip of all. But really quick, if you're learning something valuable in this video, be sure to hit that like button. Really, really helps out myself and the channel. And also be sure to sign up for the free resource library. If you're enjoying what you're learning in this video, there is much more in there curated with an actual lesson path so that you can really take your playing to the next level. All right, my next tip is actually thematic practice. What does that mean? Well, what I like to do is, especially when it comes to jazz piano, choose a specific musician who I'm really digging into right now. So what I might actually do is, let's say it's Oscar Peterson, I'll choose a few recordings where I'm going to try to memorize and transcribe parts of those solos. And then what I'll actually do is, for sight reading, I will find on YouTube, this is one of my favorite pro tips here. When I started doing this, it really, really helped me out. On YouTube, find a video, if you can, of an Oscar Peterson solo that's already been transcribed with the sheet music going with the solo. There's some fantastic YouTubers who do this. They transcribe and put it up. Just search, Oscar Peterson transcription and you will find something awesome. Then set the speed to, let's say, 0.5 speed, half speed in the YouTube settings. And then work on actually sight reading. Your sight reading material is an Oscar Peterson solo. So meanwhile, your sight reading material is Oscar Peterson. You're digesting and listening to Oscar Peterson solos, 1 to 3 solos maybe. On top of that, maybe at the same time, you are actually integrating some blues vocabulary. The voicings you're working on are actually coming from Oscar Peterson as well. And so I think you're getting the idea here. Instead of trying to do things from all these different places like, I'm doing a cluster chord and I'm learning an Oscar Peterson solo and a Brad Mehldau solo, and this Wynton Kelly recording is what I'm mainly listening to, which is kind of an overload. Really, really go deep into one player who you're trying to emulate. And this doesn't have to be just a specific player. It could be an idea. It could be, hey, I'm gonna really focus on my harmony for the next month and make everything about harmony. But I find that immersing yourself in one kind of world can be a really helpful way to stay motivated and excited about something. When you get bored, move on to the next thing. All right, here's that final tip that I think is potentially the most important tip of all. And this has to do with staggered practice or staggered repetition. This is something that is incredibly important, not just for jazz piano, but for learning in general. Have you ever had the experience where you sat down and you practiced something for 2 hours, then you go eat lunch, you come back to practice, and suddenly you just can't really do it again, even though you spent 2 hours getting it to the point where you had it perfect? Because that has happened to me many, many times. In fact, it's commonly what happens to me pretty much every single time, unless I do staggered repetition. So staggered repetition basically just means doing something like this. Day 1, let's say you practice it for an hour, go have lunch, come back, practice it again. Then I want you to, again, take 2 more breaks throughout the day and come back and practice that same thing again. Day 2, practice it 3 times throughout your day. Day 3, practice it 2 times throughout your day. And then maybe by day 4, just once, right? That is how we really put something into long-term memory. We need that repetition because the brain needs time to digest and process, and then we need to repeat it to really internalize that skill or that information. So I really like to tell my students that the way I learned the tune Donna Lee was what I would actually do way back in the day. My parents were very slow to go to high-speed internet, which at the time I think was usually Roadrunner. And I remember it being so frustrating, but I have to thank them because it's the reason I learned Donna Lee. Every time I would be logging on to AOL Instant Messenger, the whole dial-up internet process would go for about 2 minutes, and I would just practice the head to Donna Lee. I would do everything I already knew and then try to add in another little bit. Just 2-minute practice sessions, but I would do it, 5 times a day, which maybe in retrospect reveals how much I was on AOL Instant Messenger, but hey, weren't we all? And over the course of a couple weeks, just by doing these little 2-minute practice sessions, I had the head completely down. So never once did I need to sit down and practice it for 2 hours. Not even once. 2-minute practice sessions and I was able to get it. So what this shows is the power of short little practice bursts. In fact, I would say that we often demotivate ourselves by saying, I'm gonna practice for 2 hours, right? And by the end of that 2 hours, you are just sluggish, your brain's not even working that well, you're not actually making that much progress. You'd be way better to just practice a concept every time you walk by the piano 10 times throughout a day. So short sessions can actually be really, really useful. It is way more useful, I tell all my students this, it's way more useful to practice one idea for 10 minutes every day than it is to do a 3-hour practice session the day before the lesson. Now, of course, this isn't always true, but in most cases, I find that it really is. Because you get that daily repetition, your brain processes it, you sleep on it, and you really start to internalize and memorize and turn whatever that skill is into a long-term skill. So don't be upset if you're someone who can't concentrate for these really long practice sessions. When you start to lose focus or get bored, take a break and then come back and do something else that isn't boring to you. That's totally okay. Don't feel like you always have to force yourself to do things that make you lose focus or get bored or even feel tense or mentally drained. Allow your brain whatever time or change of pace it needs to come back and feel focused, because that's actually how you're gonna make the most progress and be the most efficient. All right, that's all I've got for you today, but I bet all of you have a lot more practice tips. So if you have them, tips for practicing, staying motivated, having good practice routines, let us all know in the comments. Let's make this an awesome discussion so that we can all get the most possible good information about this. And again, if you want a bunch of free lesson information, check out the free resource library. And if you're new here, click subscribe, click the little bell to turn on notifications so you don't miss any more videos just like this, and hit that like button if you learned something in this video. That really, really helps me out. Thank you so much, and I will see you next time.